So this week we're sitting on one of our projects, we're waiting for our roof trusses to come in this week, and I thought that it would be an amazing opportunity to talk structural integrity when it comes to framing and concrete, the connection points of each, so let's get to it. So the first topic we're going to talk about is overturning. Now this is the structural integrity of the components associated with the footing, its associated rebar, stem wall, and hold downs, and the associated load above it. So before we get into the details about why this structural failure occurs, we have to be able to define the term associated with overturning. In short, this type of failure occurs when there is too much load and it forces a rotation on the overall foundation components, causing the whole structure to tip over with catastrophic failure. So this type of structural failure occurs when the load above it causes the base to rotate or fail. And in this case, that has to do with the heel and the toe of our footing placement within the wall, as well as the rebar that's holding all of these components together. So let's reference a little bit about some of those components and how we go about making sure that we have structural integrity from the start at our footing, stem wall, and various connection points with our framing members. So in all fairness, in residential building, especially here in Arizona, we don't have a frost line, so we don't have to go very deep when it comes to our footings. However, when we reference a heel or a toe on a footing, the heel is going to be the portion of the footing that resides within the property, and the toe is going to be the footing that resides outside the exterior wall. This is the permanent structure that's below grade that allows us to be able to set our stem wall appropriately in place. So one of the critical components of a footing is it allows it to be able to spread the overall dead and live load of the walls and anything that exists above it across that footing or across that span. Now, the second component is going to be obviously the rebar that's associated. Now there's a reason why we have to have a footing that's thick enough to be able to fully encapsulate our rebar within 3 inches, top, bottom, left, and right, within our footing. And at various locations throughout this foundation plan, we're going to have what's called a spread footing, because we're going to have an additional dead or live load that's associated within that spot. A lot of times that's going to be around a girder truss, a glue-lam beam connection, or a point where the load is much heavier than what our standard footing detail that will allow for support. So for a better explanation, let's jump over to our plan set so that we can take a look of exactly what the specifications are for this foundation detail here at our modern row home. So to illustrate what it is that's being called out by our structural engineer, we have our exterior wall and footing detail at the garage. So as you can see here, we're going to have our toe and our heel associated in the same wall that I was just discussing. And to be able to pull it all together, we have 4 pieces of rebar that's associated within these footings. As mentioned, we have a minimum of clearance of 3 inches for our rebar matting, as well as for our number 4 dowels that are going to run up 48 inches on center to be able to attach our framing members or base plate once we get to framing. In this detail, we have a minimum of 1 foot 4 inches, so a total of 16 inches, with a minimum stem wall width of 6 inches associated that's directly centered within the space, which means that in this case we have a 5-inch toe and a 5-inch heel associated in this specific location. So as mentioned, our footing is going to be the critical component to get right to ensure that there's no overturning. And as you can imagine, the stem wall that's tied in with that vertical dowel, as well as any anchors that are associated with that stem wall that attach to the framing members, are going to be what connects that dead and live load to the overall foundation of the property. So now that we have a good definition and exactly what it is that we have here on construction site, let's talk about some of the causes that would create a catastrophic failure in the foundation. So to be able to indicate exactly why spread footings are important, if you look here at my digital set, we're sitting right here at the garage corner where we have above us a 3-ply girder truss, which we could talk about in upcoming videos, but ultimately you can see that this structural component creates a lot more dead load on the overall footing or spread footing that's associated here. So that minimum of what we talked about, 16 inches for our footing that encompasses our stem wall, isn't going to be enough to be able to carry the load associated at this point within the building structure. Now, if we didn't have a spread footing, this is where overturning could become an issue for us, because ultimately the load associated would not be able to meet the capacity that we had for the standard stem wall and footing detail at 16 inches wide. And it's for this reason that we have that spread footing that allows us to be able to take that load and be able to disperse it over the larger area and its associated rebar matting that was placed prior to the pour. And to solidify this point, we have about 15 spread footings that are located throughout the house that are going to be able to handle the associated load requirements that have been calculated by our structural engineer. So before we move on, I want to talk about one more critical component that I mentioned multiple times throughout this video, and that's the minimum embedment of 3 inches of that rebar. The main reason for that is so that ultimately our rebar is embedded, and that helps with the structural integrity of holding that concrete footing and stem wall together. And if we get too close to the edge with our rebar, we could have a blowout occur and a failure that could essentially increase the probability of an overturning event to happen at the base of our foundation. So before moving on to the next critical component of structural integrity, I mentioned a few things earlier on in the video that talk about a dead load and a live load. So let's talk about the definitions of those and how they can make a huge difference with the structural integrity of our home. The dead load is everything that's associated with the build as it sits. In short, you can count this as the permanent weight of the structure when complete. That's going to include all the framing that resides on the foundation, including any of the flooring, finishes, drywall, roofing materials, so on and so forth. The live load is going to be anything or any event that might occur to this property. That's going to be people living within the home. And it's really going to start to determine the overall deflection that's associated within the home. So a lot of times as builders, and maybe even homeowners that are looking to build a custom home, we're a little fearful when an engineer gets their hands on our plan set, because they're not actually looking just at the dead load, they're looking at the live load. What's going to happen within this area that's going to create a failure within the overall structure of the home. And that's why we have a structural engineer involved, is to be able to calculate what the live loads are for your area. Now we are here in Arizona, and so the biggest things that we would have to deal with would be like microburst or the overall livability within the home. But if you lived in some of the areas that some of my other builder friends live in, such as Utah or in areas that it snows, you're gonna have a lot larger live load associated with the amount of snow that's common for the area. If you're building in Florida, you're going to have to take into account a hurricane zone, which has extreme live loads and has specific requirements to be able to ensure the structural integrity of that home for years to come. I feel really blessed to live in Arizona where we don't have a lot of natural disasters. However, we do have monsoons and haboobs, which have microbursts associated when those storms come into place, usually in late July and all through August. And so we're going to be calculating those live loads, those microbursts of the overall load capacity of those that are going to be residing in the home. And that's what we're talking about, is really calculating how to be able to have structural integrity with this structure, regardless of the various events that might occur throughout its lifetime. So overall, to illustrate this purpose for the standard homeowner, it'd be like putting an empty bookshelf in place, stacking as much weight or books on the top shelf, and then maybe a live load like a monsoon comes in and pushes that load, and what it does is it causes the foundation to crumble and fail. Maybe the best way to illustrate this would be the building of a pyramid having a strong and wide foundation at the base with a minimal amount of weight on the top, or a Jenga tower that you continue to be able to change the overall load until there's a catastrophic failure of that foundation. So now that we've covered the structural integrity and the components associated with the foundation as it relates to catastrophic failure with overturning, so now that we've thoroughly covered the structural integrity and the importance thereof of the foundation as it relates to overturning, let's move to the next stage, which is going to talk about framing, specifically the racking and the importance of shear value associated with our framing plan. Please follow to our next video to be able to get the lowdown of one of the most important details of a house to be able to ensure the structural integrity for your home for years to come. In the meantime, feel free to comment and subscribe below so we can continue to provide top-notch content for any of our viewers. And as always, have a great day.